Hi, thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. There we go. And I'm so happy to see a good showing for this important session. I'm Jason Goldman. I'm at Swedish Medical Center, and I've been doing a lot of work with some of the other panelists on long COVID research throughout the pandemic. Here are my disclosures. So just briefly in an outline for the talk today, I was going to focus a little bit on some of the hypothesized mechanisms of long COVID, talk a little bit about the NIH RECOVER study, and go through a couple of the different proposed mechanisms. One of my favorites is viral persistence, and then talk about some of the newer or emerging ideas that are coming forth in some recent high-profile publications. This cover art was a illustration of one of our studies earlier in the pandemic that was kind of one of the first big deep dives into the biology of long COVID. All right, so I think this audience is aware of some of the symptomatology of long COVID, and it's already been described by different names. This is a study from Jenny Logue and Helen Chu early in the pandemic. That was kind of one of the first descriptions of the symptomatology of long COVID in the US. So, we see kind of some of these now well-known symptoms are common in patients who are in the post-acute phase, but not as common as they are in acute illness, of course. This is just an illustration of some of the different symptoms and how they kind of track across all the different organ systems. Neurologic is very prominent, pulmonary, cardiovascular, cutaneous, and then, of course, general symptoms, fever and rash. And it's important to note, as many of the other presenters have, just how the psychiatric overlay might be part of the long COVID syndrome or exacerbating the long COVID syndrome, but it's definitely intertwined. This was a picture from one of our patients in an observational COVID trial, and he was profiled in an article in the New York Times on long COVID for one of our earlier papers. He experienced quite a lot of psychosocial symptoms during his long COVID journey. He actually got this tattoo on his arm, which he told me all about the sort of terrors he was experiencing. So here's a cartoon about the mechanisms of PASC or long COVID. These are, of course, at this point still all proposed. None of them are really proven. But we sort of see that there's lots of different potentially overlapping mechanisms. We'll talk a little bit about viral persistence, but this might in itself lead to a chronic inflammatory state. The inflammatory state could be also the result of other parts of this diagram here. For instance, the microvascular dysfunction. There's also some theories about dysbiosis or reactivation of other latent viruses, and autoimmune reactivities as leading to some of the symptoms that people are experiencing and reporting. So the RECOVER study. So this, I think, is really quite an enormous effort on the part of the U.S. government. I think somewhere between $1.2 and $1.5 billion have been committed to this effort. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we are one of the sites, one of the hubs of this study. Jim Heath, who you'll hear from next, is the lead of our hub, and Helen Chu and I are also both sites in the hub. This is our landing page, and you can see some of the other organizations down at the bottom that are participating as part of our hub. So we've enrolled a huge number of persons to participate in this observational study. And really the goals of this study are to understand the pathophysiology of long COVID and to better explain the symptomatology and to define it better. So all of these efforts are underway within RECOVER. There's also another very important part of RECOVER, which is clinical trials, which is a little bit slow on the startup, but it has finally gotten going, and it's really exciting. And I'll talk more about this. But the RECOVER program really has quite an enormous infrastructure that you can see outlined in the slide. There's different components of the program that spans coordinating centers around the country. And there's clinical trials units that RECOVER observational enrolling cohorts that I mentioned we're participating in here in the Pacific Northwest. And there's also big EHR systems that are being sucked in and able to be analyzed within the program. A whole different network of pathobiology studies that's going to try to get at some of the underlying hypotheses. and then separate pediatric study and adult study, as well as an autopsy study. So really quite an amazing infrastructure has been spun up in a short amount of time. I think it is a large effort and there have been some bumps in the road. So it's been a little bit criticized in the media, but I think that really quite amazing things are going to come from this, if I had to predict. All right, so the first mechanism that I'll talk about briefly is this idea of viral persistence. So this study here in Nature in 2022 was one of the first studies that I think really solidified this as a real concept. This had a lot of skepticism that the virus could persist. It was thought to be a respiratory virus, which the body clears. We see in this figure, individual persons are lined up in columns, and the days from acute infection sort of march out to the right there, with the longest time period out, being 230 days, where we still see SARS-CoV-2 RNA persisting to that date. The hash lines indicate a replication competent intermediate form. So we can say that the virus is still replicating even 76 days after infection in one of these participants. So this is a small number of persons. It's an autopsy study. It's hard to get the tissues to study where the virus is persisting. So I think this is a very important proof of concept. This has been sort of covered, so I might skip it, but Paxlovid does seem to prevent in this very large observational trial some degree of long COVID. So when you get Paxlovid at the acute phase, it seems to at least prevent a bit of long COVID, and not just any long COVID, but all the components of it as well. Let's see, I think one slide might be missing there. That's okay. Similarly with vaccines, vaccines prevent long COVID, so I think it's important to note that here in the idea of viral persistence. This is the Recover Vital trial. It's explicitly studying whether Paxlovid as treatment can help to fix or treat long COVID. So in this study, patients will get either Paxlovid or placebo plus ritonavir, and different durations, 15 or 25 days. Patients are being enrolled in these different sub-phenotypes that are some of the more common symptom groups of patients presenting with long COVID. This I thought was another interesting study, but maybe I'll skip it. It's a small study showing that vaccine as treatment can actually improve symptomatology. This has been sort of anecdotally in the community and on the social networks, but the group at Yale did study this in a small group and did show most of the patients improved their symptoms after long COVID, and they did some nice immunology work around that as well in this small study. This was a recent study that came out this month that I think ties a lot of the concepts together. It got a lot of press. Some of you might have heard about it recently in the media. But basically, the bottom line of this study from Science was that some of these different pathophysiological processes might be overlapping and sort of tied together through activation of the complement system. So that might relate to coagulation and increased inflammation and tissue injury. So they did some very nice studies in this. I think there are some treatment implications that arise out of this, such as using anticoagulants or complement inhibitors in the treatment of long COVID. One more study that I thought also caught a lot of attention, and it was very nicely done, talked about serotonin reduction in post-acute sequelae after COVID. It proposed this through a viral intermediary in a gut reservoir where some of the processing of serotonin occurs, and showed that it might impair vagal function. So that could relate to some of the neurocognitive symptoms of long COVID. So I think, again, the treatment implications of this are quite clear. SSRIs, might have more effects in long COVID than just on depression or anxiety. There might be some pathophysiological processes that might be at play that factor into the neurocognitive symptoms. This is an earlier study for the pandemic showing just how vast the degree of autoantibody production is during long COVID. During COVID, this was a study in acute COVID, but there are many, many different antibodies. Some of these are targeting different tissues. Some of them are targeting immunomodulatory proteins. So, we think of this as being, needing to be explored to a much greater degree. And I think Jim's going to talk a little bit about this in his next presentation. So thanks so much, and look forward to taking questions afterwards.